Life imprisonment, Judge Sullivan declares, staring coldly at Marcus Washington. The courtroom gasps. Marcus simply smiles, picks up his phone from evidence and dials. "Dad, it's happening again!" Silence falls as everyone watches the speakerphone. "This is Attorney General James Washington. Don't move. Before we dive into this shocking story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you want to see more stories about justice prevailing against all odds. Now, what could possibly lead to this dramatic courtroom moment where a teenage boy calls the Attorney General of the United States his father? Let's find out. Marcus Washington was not your average 17-year-old. With a perfect 4.0 GPA at Pinewood High School in rural Georgia, he balanced being captain of the debate team, volunteering 20 hours weekly at the local community center, and already securing a full scholarship to Harvard University for the following fall. His brilliance was matched only by his kindness, something everyone in the predominantly black east side of Pinewood recognized. But on the west side, where the power brokers of the small town resided in their columned mansions, Marcus was viewed with suspicion and resentment. How dare a black kid from the wrong side of town outshine their own children? This unspoken sentiment pervaded Pinewood County's power structure, including its justice system where Judge Richard Sullivan had presided for 28 years. Judge Sullivan had built his reputation on being tough on crime, a phrase that everyone in Pinewood understood as code for imposing maximum sentences on black defendants while offering leniency to whites. Court records showed black defendants in his courtroom received sentences 3 times longer than whites for identical crimes, yet no one with authority had ever challenged this disparity. Marcus became acquainted with Judge Sullivan's thinly veiled racism a year earlier when he won the state debate championship. At the awards ceremony, Sullivan, whose grandson had competed against Marcus, approached him with a backhanded compliment. "You speak so well," Sullivan had said, his voice dripping with surprise. "Almost like you were coached by someone else. Are you sure you wrote that argument yourself?" Marcus had politely thanked him while ignoring the insulting implication that a black student couldn't possibly be articulate without outside help. Little did Marcus know that this uncomfortable encounter would foreshadow a much more sinister interaction. The trouble began on a Tuesday afternoon when Pinewood Pharmacy reported an armed robbery. Security footage showed someone in a dark hoodie and mask threatening the pharmacist and escaping with prescription painkillers worth thousands of dollars. The footage was grainy, the suspect's face completely obscured, but when police asked pharmacy owner Stanley Wilson if he had any suspicions, he mentioned seeing a young black male in a similar hoodie hanging around earlier. That vague description, coupled with an anonymous tip placing Marcus near the scene, was apparently all Pinewood police needed. Despite Marcus's insistence that he had been tutoring at the community center during the robbery, a fact easily verifiable by the center's security cameras, and multiple witnesses officers arrived at his home at 5 in the morning. Weapons drawn. Dr. Eleanor Washington, Marcus's mother and chief of cardiac surgery at Pinewood Medical Center, watched in horror as officers handcuffed her son while he was still in his pajamas. "He's just a child," she had protested, only to be roughly pushed aside by Officer Ryan Collins with a dismissive, "They all say that, ma'am." At the courthouse, Marcus was assigned Public Defender Thomas Reed, a middle-aged white man whose alcohol-laced breath and disheveled appearance did little to inspire confidence. Reed barely glanced at Marcus's case file before advising him to take whatever deal they offer. When Marcus attempted to explain his alibi, Reed cut him off. "Look, kid, I've got 17 other cases today. Save the stories for someone who has time." Meanwhile, Dr. Washington encountered a different form of discrimination at the courthouse. When attempting to enter the pre-trial conference room, a privilege routinely extended to parents of white defendants, the bailiff blocked her path. "Family waits outside," he stated firmly. Through the partially open door, Eleanor could see Mrs. Hutchinson, mother of a white teenager, accused of drunk driving, sitting comfortably beside her son in the same room. Eleanor was barred from entering. The evidence against Marcus was flimsy at best. The security footage showed someone roughly Marcus's height wearing a black hoodie, an item of clothing owned by thousands of teenagers. The anonymous tip came from a caller who refused to identify themselves. No weapon was found in Marcus's possession, no stolen medication recovered from his home, and no prior criminal record existed to suggest he was capable of such an act. None of this seemed to matter to District Attorney Victoria Chambers, an ambitious woman with political aspirations who saw Marcus's case as an opportunity to appear tough on crime ahead of the upcoming election. "We have a positive identification and evidence, placing the defendant at the scene," she announced at a press conference, despite having neither. As Marcus was processed, fingerprinted, and photographed, the severity of his situation began to sink in. Despite being a minor, he was placed in a holding cell with adult offenders, a clear violation of protocol that his public defender failed to challenge. From his cell, Marcus could hear fragments of a conversation in the hallway. "Mayor wants this wrapped up quickly," a voice that sounded like Sheriff Hank Peterson said. "Election season coming up." "Don't worry," replied a voice Marcus recognized as Judge Sullivan's. "I'll make an example of this one. These people need to learn their place." These words sent a chill down Marcus's spine as he realized this wasn't just about a robbery he didn't commit. He was caught in something much larger and more sinister, a system designed to maintain power by criminalizing black youth. His only hope lay in reaching his father, United States Attorney General James Washington, who was currently in Washington, D.C., pursuing high-level corruption cases. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus that the most egregious corruption might be happening in his own hometown. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Marcus's preliminary hearing began 3 days later. Local media had already painted him as a promising student turned thug, running his mugshot alongside sensationalized headlines about prescription drug epidemics and youth crime waves. Judge Sullivan entered his black robe, billowing behind him like a cape, and immediately set a tone of hostility. Case number 2453, State v. Washington, armed robbery and possession, with intent to distribute, the clerk announced. Sullivan peered down at Marcus over his reading glasses. "Another young man throwing away his future for quick money," he commented, making no attempt to hide his prejudgment. District Attorney Chambers presented the state's case with theatrical flair, gesturing dramatically as she described a cold, calculated crime committed by a wolf in sheep's clothing. Stanley Wilson, the pharmacy owner, took the stand first. His testimony seemed rehearsed as he described seeing the defendant lurking outside my store hours before the robbery. When asked if he could positively identify Marcus as the robber, Wilson hesitated before saying, "The build and the way he moved was identical." This contradicted his initial police statement where he admitted he couldn't identify the masked perpetrator. Public Defender Reed failed to point out this discrepancy during his half-hearted cross-examination. The security footage was played next. The grainy black and white video showed a figure in a dark hoodie face completely obscured by both the hood and what appeared to be a medical mask. Nothing about the figure was identifiable as Marcus, yet D.A. Chambers presented it as if it were definitive evidence. "Notice the defendant's distinctive gait," she said, though there was nothing distinctive about the normal walking pattern displayed. When Marcus whispered to Reed to object to this characterization, his lawyer simply shushed him. Marcus's alibi witnesses from the community center waited outside the courtroom ready to testify that he had been tutoring underprivileged children during the exact time of the robbery. Miss Evelyn Carter, the center's director, had sign-in sheets and even photographs of Marcus working with students that afternoon. Judge Sullivan, however, severely limited their testimony, calling it cumulative and suggesting they were clearly biased in favor of the defendant. During a brief recess, Marcus's mind drifted to the conversation he'd had with his father the night before his arrest. James Washington had called from D.C., his voice tired but determined. "I'm getting closer, son," he'd said cryptically. "These corruption cases in Southern judicial systems go deeper than anyone imagined. Judges, police, prosecutors, all working together to fill private prisons with our people." "Be careful, Dad," Marcus had replied, never imagining he would soon be caught in exactly the type of corrupt system his father was investigating. When court resumed, Officer Collins testified about finding Marcus's black hoodie during the search of his bedroom, presenting it as evidence, though it matched thousands of similar garments and bore no connection to the crime. When Marcus attempted to speak in his own defense, Judge Sullivan sharply reprimanded him. "You will speak when and if your attorney calls you to testify, young man, not before." Reed, meanwhile, appeared more interested in the clock than in defending his client, checking his watch repeatedly as the state built its case. The most damning evidence came when Detective Scott Palmer testified about a bag of prescription pills allegedly found in Marcus's school locker during a routine search. This was the first Marcus had heard of such a search, and he knew immediately the drugs had been planted. His suspicions were confirmed when he recognized Detective Palmer as the same officer who had pulled him over 2 months earlier for driving too nice a car. Palmer had searched Marcus's vehicle without consent, finding nothing, but had warned him, "I've got my eye on you, boy. Nobody rides this clean without dirt somewhere." The school's security camera footage that would have shown who accessed Marcus's locker was conveniently malfunctioning that day. Similarly, when Reed finally thought to request the community center's security footage that would prove Marcus's alibi, he was told it had been accidentally erased during routine system maintenance. Every piece of exculpatory evidence seemed to vanish, while incriminating evidence appeared from nowhere. Throughout the proceedings, Judge Sullivan's bias was barely concealed. He sustained virtually every objection from the prosecution, while dismissing defense objections without consideration. He referred to Marcus as the perpetrator rather than the defendant multiple times, and allowed Chambers to make inflammatory statements about thugs hiding behind good grades. When Dr. Washington attempted to speak on her son's behalf regarding his character, Sullivan cut her off mid-sentence. "A mother's love blinds her to her child's faults," he remarked dismissively. The final blow came when Judge Sullivan denied bail, claiming Marcus was a flight risk, despite his deep community ties, perfect attendance record, and lack of resources to flee. Given the serious nature of these charges and the defendant's obvious disregard for the law, bail is denied. The defendant will be remanded to juvenile detention until trial. As Marcus was led away in handcuffs, he caught sight of his mother's tear-streaked face and felt a surge of both despair and determination. The system was rigged against him, that much was clear. What wasn't clear was how he would fight back against a corruption so deeply entrenched that it had ensnared him in its web with frightening efficiency. One thing Marcus knew for certain: he needed to reach his father. Attorney General James Washington needed to know that the very corruption he was fighting nationally had now targeted his own son. 2 weeks in juvenile detention had changed Marcus in ways he never thought possible. The bright, optimistic Harvard-bound student was being methodically replaced by a wary, vigilant young man who slept with one eye open. Pinewood Juvenile Detention Center was a microcosm of America's racial dynamics, with clear dividing lines between white and black detainees. The white juveniles, many with wealthy parents and paid attorneys, typically stayed for days rather than weeks, while black teens languished for months awaiting trial dates that kept getting postponed. Marcus quickly learned that racial tensions weren't limited to the detainees. Guard Thomas Briggs took special pleasure in forgetting to let Marcus out for meals or showers, while offering privileges to white detainees. "Washington, you think you're special because you use big words," Briggs would taunt. "In here, you're just another statistic waiting to happen." The situation was complicated by Marcus's intelligence and education, which made him a target from multiple directions. A group of white supremacist detainees, led by 17-year-old Cody Thornton, had marked Marcus from day one. "Heard you think you're going to Harvard," Thornton had sneered during yard time. "Only way you'll see Cambridge is on a prison television documentary." Meanwhile, some black detainees resented what they perceived as Marcus's privileged upbringing. "Doctor's son slumming it with us, common folks," one had commented, though most eventually accepted him after learning his story. The one bright spot in this bleak existence was visits from Miss Plant Persake, Evelyn Carter, Marcus's former teacher and mentor. She came every visiting day, bringing books on law and criminal justice that she had to fight to get approved by detention administrators. "I'm not giving up on you, Marcus. she assured him during her latest visit. "Something isn't right about this whole case, and I'm going to figure it out." "They've got everything rigged," Marcus replied, keeping his voice low to avoid being overheard by guards. "Every piece of evidence that could help me disappears, while evidence against me keeps magically appearing." Miss Carter nodded grimly. "I've been doing some digging. Did you know that Stanley Wilson, the pharmacy owner, sits on the same real estate development board as Judge Sullivan? They're both investors in something called Pinewood Growth Partners." This information sparked something in Marcus's mind. A connection he couldn't quite place yet, but he filed it away for future consideration. Outside the detention center, the case was taking a toll on Marcus's family. Dr. Eleanor Washington, once the most respected surgeon in Pinewood Medical Center, now found colleagues avoiding her in hallways and referring patients to other doctors. It hadn't escaped her notice that Margaret Sullivan, the judge's wife, sat on the hospital's board of directors and had recently called for a review of staffing needs in the cardiac department. Meanwhile, Mayor Franklin Davis was using Marcus's case to fuel his re-election campaign. At a press conference held on the courthouse steps, he proclaimed, "This administration is committed to cleaning up our streets and ensuring that criminals face consequences regardless of their family connections or academic achievements." The coded message was clear to everyone in Pinewood. No black person was above suspicion, no matter their credentials. Marcus tried repeatedly to call his father in Washington, D.C., but the detention center's phone system seemed to malfunction specifically during his allocated phone time. On the rare occasions he got through, the calls were cut short after just minutes, often right as he began explaining the details of his case. "Dad, they've planted evidence in my school locker," he had managed to say during their last truncated call. "And the the line went dead before he could finish." The memory of his father's journey from civil rights attorney to U.S. Attorney General gave Marcus strength during his darkest moments. James Washington had started as a public defender in Atlanta, fighting for clients much like Marcus himself was now. Through sheer brilliance and determination, he had risen through the ranks of the Justice Department, eventually being appointed Attorney General by the President. What few people knew was that James had been quietly investigating judicial corruption in southern states for the past year, building cases against judges and prosecutors who showed patterns of racial discrimination and connections to private prison corporations. Marcus wondered if his own case was connected to his father's investigation. Had he been targeted because he was James Washington's son? The thought both terrified and strengthened him. While Marcus strategized in detention, Miss in Somerset, Carter continued her investigation on the outside. She discovered that not only did the pharmacy owner have connections to Judge Sullivan, but both men had financial ties to Oakwood Private Correctional Facilities, a company that received government funding based on occupancy rates. Every new inmate meant more profit, especially young inmates who could potentially spend decades in the system. When Marcus's public defender, Thomas Reed, finally visited him again, it wasn't to discuss defense strategy, but to pressure him into accepting a plea deal. 10 years, Reed said without preamble. D.A. Chambers is willing to drop it from 25 if you plead guilty. "I'm not pleading guilty to something I didn't do," Marcus replied firmly. "I have an alibi. I was tutoring at the community center." Reed sighed dramatically. "Kid, you don't get it. They've got your hoodie pills in your locker and a witness putting you at the scene. No one cares about your tutoring story." "Then they should care about due process and evidence tampering," Marcus countered, having spent hours studying law books in the detention center's limited library. "The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches and seizures. They had no warrant for my locker." Reed looked momentarily surprised by Marcus's legal knowledge before his expression hardened. "Playing jailhouse lawyer won't help you. Take the deal or risk life in prison. Judge Sullivan doesn't like smart Alex." After Reed left, Marcus continued his legal education, preparing to defend himself if necessary. He documented every procedural violation, every instance of evidence appearing or disappearing, and every biased comment from Judge Sullivan. If he couldn't fight the system from the outside, he would learn to fight it from within. What Marcus couldn't see was Sheriff Hank Peterson entering the evidence room after hours, removing the original pharmacy security footage and replacing it with an edited version. He couldn't see D.A. Chambers coaching witnesses on their testimony. And he couldn't see Judge Sullivan on the phone with private prison executives, assuring them that the Washington boy will be in the system for years guaranteed. When Marcus was informed that his trial had been scheduled for the following week, giving his defense virtually no time to prepare, he understood that the railroad was nearing its destination. His requests for a different judge were repeatedly denied, with court administrators citing standard protocol and judicial discretion. As he lay on his hard detention center bed that night, Marcus made a decision. If he couldn't beat this corrupt system playing by its rules, perhaps it was time to change the game entirely. He needed to get a message to his father, one that couldn't be intercepted or cut short. The Attorney General of the United States needed to know exactly what was happening in Pinewood, Georgia. Do you think Marcus is being treated fairly by the justice system? Comment number 1 if you believe the system is rigged against him, or comment number 2 if you think there's more to this story than meets the eye. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories about justice and injustice in America. What will Marcus do to get a message to his father? And what will happen when the U.S. Attorney General discovers his son is being railroaded by a corrupt judge? Keep watching to find out. The trial of Marcus Washington began on a Monday morning in July, with temperatures outside the courthouse reaching 98 degrees and tensions inside running even hotter. The jury selection process had been a masterclass in systematic exclusion. Of the 50 potential jurors in the pool, 22 were black, yet D.A. Chambers had used peremptory challenges to remove all but one, resulting in a jury of 11 whites and one elderly black woman who had relatives in law. Enforcement. When Public Defender Reed finally objected to this obvious pattern after the 18th dismissal, Judge Sullivan overruled him, stating that the prosecution had provided race-neutral explanations for each strike. These explanations ranged from seemed hesitant to maintain eye contact to has a nephew the same age as the defendant. From his seat at the defense table, Marcus could see Brian Sullivan, the judge's 19-year-old nephew, sitting in the gallery with a smirk on his face. Marcus had never spoken to Brian, but he recognized him from news coverage of his 3 drunk driving arrests, none of which had resulted in significant consequences beyond community service. Something about Brian's presence made Marcus uneasy, a sensation that intensified when he noticed Brian nervously fingering a bottle of pills, similar to those allegedly stolen from the pharmacy. D.A. Chambers approached the jury with confidence, her crimson suit drawing all eyes as she painted Marcus as a wolf in sheep's clothing, who had fooled teachers and community members with a facade of academic excellence while secretly planning a drug operation. Her opening statement was filled with emotional appeals and references to keeping our community safe rather than concrete evidence. Throughout her presentation, Marcus scribbled notes on a legal pad documenting mischaracterizations and outright fabrications that Reed should challenge. When he passed these notes to his lawyer, Reed either ignored them or gave them cursory glances before continuing to doodle on his own notepad. The prosecution's case began with Stanley Wilson, the pharmacy owner, who now claimed with absolute certainty that he had seen Marcus casing his store hours before the robbery. "I never forget a face," Wilson insisted, though in his initial police statement he had been unable to identify the masked robber. When Reed failed to bring up this contradiction during cross-examination, Marcus wrote in large letters, "Prior inconsistent statement," and slid it in front of his lawyer. Reed frowned, asked one half-hearted question about Wilson's memory, then sat down without pursuing the obvious line of attack. Next came the manipulated security footage shown on a large screen for the jury. D.A. Chambers narrated the grainy video as if it clearly showed Marcus pointing out distinctive features of the hooded figure that could have matched thousands of people. When Reed's turn came, he merely asked if the face was visible in the footage, accepted the negative answer, and again sat down without challenging the supposed identification. By lunchtime, Marcus was fighting panic. His case wasn't just being poorly defended, it was being deliberately thrown. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., Attorney General James Washington sat in his office reviewing disturbing statistics. A federal investigation into judicial patterns had flagged Pinewood County for having the highest racial disparity in sentencing in the state of Georgia. Black defendants received sentences averaging 3 times longer than whites for identical crimes, with Judge Richard Sullivan's courtroom showing the most extreme disparities. James had been building a case for federal intervention, unaware that his own son had become entangled in the very system he was investigating. His administrative assistant interrupted his concentration. "Sir, there's been another attempt by your son to reach you. The Juvenile Detention Center in Pinewood reported technical difficulties with the call." James frowned. Marcus had been trying to reach him for days, but each call mysteriously failed. "Get me the director of that facility on the phone," he instructed, "and book me on the next flight to Georgia." As the trial resumed after lunch, Marcus's mind flashed back to an incident from the previous year. As student body president, he had organized a peaceful protest against the school's policy of disproportionately disciplining black students for dress code violations. Principal George Thompson had called him into his office afterward. "Washington, you're making waves in a pond that doesn't want to be disturbed," Thompson had warned. "You've got a bright future ahead of you. Don't jeopardize it by becoming a troublemaker." The memory strengthened Marcus's resolve. He had been targeted before for challenging systemic racism. The difference now was the stakes had become life-altering. The afternoon brought more prosecution witnesses, each seemingly coached to emphasize Marcus's guilt while avoiding specifics that could be challenged. Officer Ryan Collins testified about finding a black hoodie in Marcus's bedroom, identical to the one worn by the perpetrator, though he admitted under Reed's minimal cross-examination that it was a common style sold in thousands of stores nationwide. Detective Scott Palmer described finding prescription pills in Marcus's school locker during what he called a routine search, though he could provide no warrant or documentation authorizing such a search. Midway through Palmer's testimony, juror number 8, a middle-aged white woman who had been taking detailed notes and asking thoughtful questions, raised her hand. "Your Honor, I'm confused about the timeline. When was this locker search conducted in relation to the robbery?" Judge Sullivan appeared momentarily flustered by this reasonable question. "The jury will refrain from direct questioning. If you have inquiries, write them down for consideration during deliberation." The next morning, juror number 8 was mysteriously absent, replaced by an alternate who was the brother-in-law of a Pinewood police officer. When Reed questioned this substitution, Judge Sullivan cited personal emergency reasons that could not be disclosed. The railroading continued as Judge Sullivan systematically blocked key defense witnesses from testifying. Miss Carter was limited to answering yes or no questions about Marcus's presence at the community center, prevented from elaborating on the timeline that would have proven his alibi. 3 students whom Marcus had been tutoring during the robbery were deemed cumulative witnesses and not allowed to testify at all. Even Dr. Washington's character testimony was severely restricted, with the judge sustaining objections to nearly every substantive statement she attempted to make about her son. Throughout the proceedings, local media continued their prejudicial coverage. The Pinewood Gazette ran daily headlines like "Honor Students Double Life Exposed" and "Drug Dealer Hid Behind Academic Achievements," treating Marcus's guilt as a foregone conclusion. These papers were available in the courthouse lobby, where jurors passed daily, despite Reed's weak objection to this potential influence on the jury. During a brief recess, Marcus overheard a courthouse deputy speaking to someone on the phone. "Make sure she understands what happens if the kid doesn't stay quiet," the deputy said in hushed tones. A tragic car accident on River Road would be a shame for such a respected doctor. The threat against his mother sent ice through Marcus's veins. The corruption wasn't just about securing his conviction. These people were willing to harm his family to maintain their system. When court resumed, Public Defender Reed delivered a closing argument so brief and ineffective that several jurors exchanged confused glances. He spoke for less than 10 minutes, mostly reiterating that reasonable doubt should guide their decision without pointing to any specific evidence creating such doubt. In contrast, D.A. Chambers spoke for over an hour, weaving a compelling narrative of Marcus's supposed descent from honor student to drug dealer, connecting imaginary dots with theatrical flair and emotional appeals. As Reed sat down after his closing, Marcus realized with grim clarity that his defense had never been intended to succeed. The system wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as designed, eliminating those who threatened its power structure. As Judge Sullivan prepared his instructions to the jury, Marcus made a decision. The time for playing by their rules had ended. He needed to create a moment so undeniable, so public, that even this corrupt system couldn't sweep it under the rug, and he knew exactly how to do it. The jury's deliberation lasted exactly 73 minutes, a duration so brief for a case involving multiple charges and days of testimony that even courthouse veterans seemed surprised. Marcus wasn't. He understood that the verdict had been predetermined. The trial, merely theater designed to give a veneer of legitimacy to a conclusion reached long before any evidence was presented. While the jury was out, Marcus requested a private meeting with Judge Sullivan. "Your Honor," he said through Reed, "I'd like to speak with you in chambers before the verdict is announced." Sullivan's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "This is highly irregular, Mr. Washington. Any communications should go through your attorney." "It concerns a matter of judicial ethics," Marcus persisted. "Information that should be addressed privately." This seemed to unsettle Sullivan momentarily, but he quickly recovered. Request denied. "We will proceed according to proper protocol." Marcus nodded, having expected this response. The denial would simply become another link in the chain of documentation he was building. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., Attorney General James Washington was boarding a government plane bound for Georgia. After multiple failed attempts to reach Marcus by phone and increasingly disturbing reports about irregularities in his son's case, James had decided personal intervention was necessary. He had also dispatched a team of federal investigators to Pinewood County to gather preliminary evidence of judicial misconduct. During the brief break before the jury returned, Marcus accessed the detention center's law library computer one last time. For weeks, he had been researching federal jurisdiction over corrupted state proceedings, particularly cases involving civil rights violations and systematic discrimination. He had memorized key precedents and statutes, preparing for the moment when he would need this knowledge. His research had revealed something crucial. Certain types of corruption were so fundamental that they triggered automatic federal oversight, particularly when patterns of discrimination could be proven. As Marcus was escorted back to the courtroom, he reflected on a conversation with his father months earlier. They had been discussing a high-profile case of police brutality that James was investigating. "The system doesn't change willingly," Marcus, his father, had told him. "Sometimes it takes someone brave enough to stand in the gears and force people to acknowledge the injustice that's always been there." "Isn't that dangerous?" Marcus had asked. James had nodded solemnly. "Standing up to systemic injustice, always island. But staying silent is more dangerous in the long run. Silence kills slowly, while truth might hurt immediately but ultimately heals." These words resonated with Marcus now as he took his seat at the defense table. The courtroom was packed with community members, local media, and several national outlets drawn by the unusual case of an honor student facing life imprisonment for a first-time offense. The jury filed in, most avoiding eye contact with Marcus, though the lone black juror gave him a subtle look of apology. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Sullivan asked, his tone suggesting this was merely a formality. "We have, Your Honor," the foreman replied, handing a folded paper to the bailiff. Sullivan read it silently, a small smile of satisfaction crossing his face before he composed his expression into one of judicial gravity. "On the count of armed robbery in the first degree, how do you find guilty, Your Honor? On the count of possession with intent to distribute Schedule II controlled substances, how do you find guilty, Your Honor? On the count of assault with a deadly weapon, how do you find guilty, Your Honor?" Each guilty struck Marcus like a physical blow, though none came as a surprise. He remained outwardly calm, his posture straight, his gaze steady. In the gallery, Dr. Eleanor Washington broke down her shoulders, shaking with silent sobs. Behind her, A group of Marcus's classmates and community center students held hands, some openly weeping, others displaying signs reading "Justice for Marcus" that courthouse deputies quickly confiscated. Judge Sullivan addressed Marcus directly. "The defendant will rise for sentencing." This departure from normal procedure sentencing typically occurred weeks after verdict confirmed to Marcus that everything had been orchestrated in advance. Before standing, Marcus formally stated, "Your Honor, I request new counsel for the sentencing phase. I believe my current representation has been ineffective." Sullivan's face darkened. "Request denied. Stand for sentencing." As Marcus rose, he began meticulously documenting every procedural violation in a notebook he had kept hidden. He had created a record of every biased statement, every denied request, every piece of evidence that mysteriously appeared or disappeared. This documentation would be crucial for what would come next. While the courtroom focused on the unfolding drama of the verdict, outside forces were gathering. Evidence was emerging that Brian Sullivan, the judge's nephew, had been seen with prescription drugs matching those stolen from the pharmacy on the night of the robbery. A night security guard at the high school had come forward claiming he had witnessed Detective Palmer planting evidence in Marcus's locker, and Miss Pan Carter had located security footage from a business adjacent to the community center, clearly showing Marcus entering and not leaving during the time of the robbery. None of this information had been allowed into the trial. Across town at the Pinewood Country Club, Sheriff Hank Peterson and Mayor Franklin Davis were celebrating the verdict with expensive bourbon, unaware that their conversation was being recorded by a waiter sympathetic to Marcus's cause. Sullivan delivered as promised, Peterson said, keeping his voice low despite their private booth. "This ought to keep them in their place for a while." Davis nodded, swirling his drink. "One Harvard-bound kid taken down sends a message to all of them. Don't rise too high, don't make waves. The private prison contract goes through next week," Peterson added. 30% occupancy guarantee means we need to keep those cells filled." "Well," Davis chuckled, "we've got plenty of candidates in the East Side." As Judge Sullivan prepared to announce what everyone in the courtroom knew would be an unprecedented sentence for a first-time offender, he shuffled papers on his bench. What no one could see was that his sentencing remarks had been written days earlier, before the trial had even concluded further evidence of the predetermined nature of the proceedings. Sullivan cleared his throat, ready to deliver the crushing blow that would send Marcus Washington to prison for decades. He had no way of knowing that in moments, his carefully constructed system of corruption would begin to unravel, all because of a 17-year-old who refused to be another statistic in a rigged game. The Pinewood County Courthouse had never been so crowded. Word of Marcus Washington's case had spread beyond local media to national outlets, drawing journalists from Atlanta, New York, and Washington, D.C. The gallery was filled to capacity, with a line of spectators stretching down the hallway and out the front doors. Dr. Eleanor Washington sat in the front row, her normally impeccable appearance showing signs of the toll the past weeks had taken. Next to her sat several colleagues from Pinewood Medical Center who had risked their own standing to support her. Marcus's classmates and teachers occupied several rows behind them, while community members from East Pinewood filled any remaining space. Judge Richard Sullivan surveyed the packed courtroom with thinly veiled annoyance. He had expected his railroad job to proceed quietly, not become a spectacle drawing national attention. The delay in Attorney General James Washington's flight due to mechanical issues had created a timeline that worked against Marcus. The federal cavalry his father could summon was still hours away, while justice in Sullivan's courtroom moved with unprecedented speed when it suited his purposes. Before the court proceeds to sentencing, does the defendant wish to make a statement? Sullivan asked, a procedural formality he expected would yield nothing of consequence. Marcus stood his posture straight despite the weight of the verdict. "No, Your Honor." His response surprised everyone, including his own attorney. Defendants typically used this opportunity to express remorse or plead for leniency. Marcus's silence was a strategic decision. He would save his words for when they could actually matter. Sullivan nodded, seemingly pleased by Marcus's apparent defeat. He pulled a sheaf of papers from his bench and began what would become one of the most racially charged judicial statements ever recorded in Pinewood County. Marcus Washington Sullivan began, his voice resonating through the now silent courtroom. "You stand before this court, having been found guilty of serious crimes against our community. Your actions reveal the character that lies beneath the facade of academic achievement and community involvement." Sullivan continued, his language becoming increasingly pointed. "Too often we see young men like you who believe their intelligence entitles them to operate outside the law. You thought your Harvard acceptance and your father's position would shield you from consequences." Each word dripped with condescension and barely concealed racial animus. This court has seen a disturbing pattern of young thugs from certain neighborhoods who believe the rules don't apply to them. They hide behind accomplishments and family connections, believing these will provide immunity from justice. As Sullivan spoke, Marcus observed Brian Sullivan nervously whispering to Sheriff Peterson at the back of the courtroom. The sheriff nodded and discreetly positioned deputies near the exits as if preparing for something. Marcus also noticed the lone black juror from his trial had returned to witness the sentencing, her expression a mixture of guilt and horror as she listened to Sullivan's speech. The judge continued his diatribe, citing similar cases where he had handed down maximum sentences to black teenagers for relatively minor offenses. Without saying it explicitly, he was revealing the pattern of discrimination that characterized his judicial career. Last year, Jamal Turner stood where you stand now, thinking his basketball scholarship would save him from justice. He's currently serving 15 years. Before him, Deshaun Morris thought his community service would matter. 20 years. The list goes on. What Sullivan didn't mention was that white defendants in his courtroom, with identical or worse charges, routinely received probation or suspended sentences. As the judge neared his conclusion, the courtroom doors burst open. "Miss." Evelyn Carter rushed in, clutching a USB drive. "Your Honor, I have exculpatory evidence that proves Marcus's innocence," she called out. Two deputies immediately moved to physically remove her. "This is recovered security footage showing Marcus at the community center during the robbery." Miss Carter continued to shout as she was dragged toward the exit. Sullivan banged his gavel. "Remove her immediately and charge her with contempt of court." The commotion created a distraction that Dr. Isley Dutt. Washington seized upon. Rising from her seat, she approached Stanley Wilson, the pharmacy owner, who had testified against Marcus. "How much did they pay you to lie about my son?" she demanded, her voice carrying through the courtroom. "I know about your development deal with Sullivan. Was it worth destroying an innocent child's life?" Wilson paled visibly, but was saved from responding by Sullivan's thunderous gavel. "Dr. Washington, return to your seat or join Miss Carter in contempt." Charges. Eleanor reluctantly returned to her place, but the seeds of doubt had been publicly planted. Judge Sullivan, visibly rattled but determined to complete his task, shuffled his papers and delivered the sentence he had prepared days before the verdict was even reached. "Marcus Washington, having been found guilty of all charges, this court sentences you to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 25 years. A collective gasp filled the courtroom. Even for the charges in question, this sentence was unprecedented in its severity, particularly for a first-time offender who was still a minor. It was at this moment that Marcus made his move. With a calm that belied the gravity of the situation, he reached toward the evidence box still sitting on the defense table from the trial. "Your Honor, pursuant to Georgia Code Section 16-5-94, a defendant has the right to collect personal effects entered as evidence after sentencing and before transfer to corrections." This obscure procedural rule, which Marcus had memorized during his legal research, momentarily caught Sullivan off guard. Before the judge could respond, Marcus had retrieved his cell phone from the evidence box. A deputy moved to stop him, but hesitated when Marcus calmly stated, "Interference with this procedural right constitutes grounds for immediate federal review under civil rights statutes." The deputy looked to Judge Sullivan for guidance, creating a crucial moment of hesitation. In that brief window, Marcus powered on his phone, which the evidence clerks had failed to disable. The courtroom fell silent as he dialed a number from memory, and activated the speakerphone function. Everyone watched, transfixed by his inexplicable composure in the face of a life sentence. After 2 rings, an authoritative voice answered, "James Washington. Dad, it's happening again." Marcus's voice was steady, controlled. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted instantly. Judge Sullivan's face drained of color as he realized who was on the other end of the call. "This is Attorney General James Washington. Don't move." The voice from the phone carried the unmistakable authority of the nation's top law enforcement officer. "Marcus, are you in Judge Sullivan's courtroom right now?" "Yes, sir. He just sentenced me to life imprisonment." There was a momentary pause before the Attorney General spoke again, his voice now amplified by the courtroom sound system as deputies had frozen, unsure whether to cut off a call with a federal official. "Judge Richard Sullivan, this is United States Attorney General James Washington. I am informing you that as of 6:45 this morning, your court has been placed under federal investigation for systematic civil rights violations and corruption. Any further proceedings in the case of my son are hereby suspended pending review." Sullivan found his voice, though it trembled slightly. "This is a state matter, Mr. Attorney General. You have no jurisdiction here." On the contrary, James Washington replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Federal agents are currently en route to your courthouse with warrants for records related to racial disparities in sentencing and financial connections between court officials and private prison corporations. I suggest you do not attempt to destroy any records or leave the building." The courtroom erupted in murmurs and exclamations as the full impact of what was happening began to sink in. Marcus stood calmly at the center of the storm he had created, phone still in hand, as Judge Sullivan's carefully constructed world began to collapse around him. Have you ever witnessed or experienced injustice in the legal system? Comment number 1, if you believe racial bias still affects our courts today, or comment number 2, if you think the system generally works as it should. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to see more stories that expose corruption and celebrate those brave enough to fight back. What do you think will happen now that the U.S. Attorney General knows about the corruption in Pinewood? Will Marcus be freed, or will the powerful forces aligned against him find a way to maintain their grip on power? Stay tuned to find out. The silence that followed Attorney General James Washington's declaration was profound, broken only by the soft sound of Judge Sullivan's gavel slipping from his fingers and clattering onto his bench. For several seconds, no one moved, as if the courtroom had been frozen in time, at the moment when power dynamics fundamentally shifted. The spell broke when Sheriff Peterson signaled to his deputies to approach Marcus. "The boy is still in custody under state authority," Peterson declared, moving toward the defense table. "Phone or no phone, federal investigation or not." Before the deputies could reach Marcus, the courtroom doors swung open again. 4 individuals in dark suits entered, badges visible on their belts. Federal Bureau of Investigation announced the lead agent, a tall woman with close-cropped hair. "Sheriff Peterson, your deputies will stand down immediately. This courthouse is now under federal jurisdiction per Order SDG-A 2542. The disbelief on Peterson's face was matched only by the panic now evident in Judge Sullivan's expression. "This is outrageous," Sullivan sputtered, finding his voice at last. "You cannot simply waltz in and commandeer a state proceeding." "Actually, Your Honor," the FBI agent replied, placing particular emphasis on his title, "we can and we are. Perhaps you'd like to review the federal statute on judicial corruption investigations while we secure the premises." As the agents took positions around the courtroom, Attorney General Washington continued speaking through the phone. Still held by Marcus. "Agent Ramirez, please ensure all court records are secured, particularly sentencing patterns, for the past 5 years, and have someone retrieve Miss Prasis, Mrs. Ravermus Evelyn Carter, who I understand has been removed from the courtroom with exculpatory evidence." Sullivan's face reddened. "I am still the presiding judge in this jurisdiction. I will not be dictated to in my own courtroom." Former presiding judge corrected James Washington through the speaker. "As of this morning, you have been temporarily removed from the bench pending investigation. The Chief Justice of the Georgia Supreme Court signed the order 3 hours ago." This revelation sent another shock wave through the courtroom. The investigation hadn't just begun, it had been underway for months, with Marcus's case becoming the catalyst for action rather than the cause. Marcus finally spoke again, addressing the courtroom rather than the phone. For the past 6 months, the Department of Justice has been investigating patterns of racial discrimination in sentencing across multiple southern jurisdictions. Pinewood County showed the most extreme disparities in the state of Georgia. The confident way Marcus delivered this information made it clear that he had been aware of the investigation, though not that he would become a target himself. It was a stunning revelation that changed the context of everything that had happened in the preceding weeks. Judge Sullivan attempted to regain control of the situation. "Clear the courtroom immediately. This proceeding is adjourned." "The only people leaving this room," Agent Ramirez countered, "are those we permit to leave after identification." Judge Sullivan, Sheriff Peterson, District Attorney Chambers, and Public Defender Reed will remain for preliminary questioning. As if on cue, additional FBI agents entered with document boxes and digital equipment. "We have warrants for all court records, financial disclosures, and communications between court officials, law enforcement, and Oakwood private correctional facilities." At the mention of the private prison corporation, Mayor Davis, who had been observing from the gallery, attempted to quietly exit. An agent smoothly intercepted him. "Mayor Davis, we'll need you to remain as well. We have some questions about certain investments and municipal contracts." Meanwhile, Marcus had been reunited with his mother, their embrace, a silent testimony to the weeks of separation and suffering. Dr. Washington held her son tightly, tears streaming down her face. "I never lost faith," she whispered. "Neither did I," Marcus replied. "Dad made sure I understood what was happening without saying it directly. Our calls kept getting cut off because they knew who he was." The revelation that Marcus had been part of a larger strategy to expose corruption changed the narrative entirely. What had appeared to be a tragic case of injustice was revealed as a carefully documented investigation into systematic civil rights violations. Sought, Carter was escorted back into the courtroom, still clutching the USB drive containing security footage that proved Marcus's alibi. "I've been gathering evidence for weeks," she explained to the FBI agents. "The community center's cameras weren't actually broken. I saved a copy before they could destroy it." As agents began setting up equipment to view the footage, another revelation emerged. Marcus raised his wrist, displaying what appeared to be an ordinary watch. "Everything said in this courtroom and in my meetings with Public Defender Reed has been recorded," he announced, "including Judge Sullivan's comments about making an example of me and keeping them in their place." The watch, a gift from his father, contained a sophisticated recording device that had documented countless instances of bias and procedural violations. The color drained from Reed's face as he realized his incompetent defense was now evidence of collusion. Across the courtroom, Stanley Wilson, the pharmacy owner whose testimony had been crucial to the prosecution, began fidgeting nervously. An FBI agent approached him with a document. "Mr. Wilson, we have records of financial transactions between your business and Judge Sullivan's real estate company immediately following your testimony. Would you like to revise your statements now, or shall we add perjury and conspiracy charges?" Wilson's resolve crumbled visibly. "I never actually saw Marcus near the pharmacy that day," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "Sullivan said if I didn't cooperate, my business license would be under review and my loan applications would be denied." One by one, the pillars of the prosecution's case collapsed as witnesses recanted under federal scrutiny and evidence of tampering emerged. The security footage from Miss Carter clearly showed Marcus tutoring students at the community center during the exact time of the robbery. Phone records confirmed his location. And most damning of all, multiple witnesses now came forward to implicate Brian Sullivan, the judge's nephew, as the actual perpetrator of the pharmacy robbery. Brian has had a prescription drug problem for years, revealed a former classmate who had been too frightened to speak previously. His uncle kept covering it up, getting charges dropped, records sealed. Everyone knew, but nobody could say anything. As the afternoon progressed, the full scope of the corruption became clear. Documents produced by federal investigators showed a disturbing pattern. Black defendants in Pinewood County received sentences averaging 3 to 4 times longer than whites for identical offenses. Judge Sullivan had the most extreme disparity, with some cases showing factors of 10 or more between sentences for black and white defendants with similar charges and backgrounds. Financial records revealed the motive behind this discrimination. Judge Sullivan, Sheriff Peterson, and Mayor Davis all held investments in Oakwood private correctional facilities, which received government funding based on occupancy rates. The higher the prison population, the more profitable their investments became. This created a direct financial incentive to incarcerate as many people as possible for as long as possible. "We found evidence of a quota system," explained Agent Ramirez to Attorney General Washington, who had joined the investigation via secure video link. Monthly targets for arrests and convictions with demographic breakdowns suggesting racial targeting was explicit policy. Marcus's case had been meant to serve as both a warning to the black community and a high-value addition to the prison population. A young man who could potentially spend decades in the system, generating hundreds of thousands of $100 in revenue for the private prison and its investors. By evening, federal agents had taken control of the courthouse and all its records. Judge Sullivan, Sheriff Peterson, Mayor Davis, and DA Chambers were in federal custody facing charges ranging from civil rights violations to racketeering, conspiracy, and corruption. Public Defender Reed was being investigated as a potential co-conspirator for his deliberately ineffective representation of black defendants. As Marcus finally walked out of the courthouse, a free man, the eastern sky was darkening while the western horizon still held the last light of day, a fitting metaphor for the closing of one chapter and the beginning of another. Standing on the courthouse steps beside his mother, surrounded by supporters and media, Marcus saw a government car approaching. The vehicle stopped, and United States Attorney General James Washington emerged, his normally composed face showing the strain of the past weeks and the relief of the present moment. Father and son embraced in a reunion that symbolized not just a family reconnected, but justice finally served in a system designed to deny it. The morning after the dramatic courtroom revelation, Marcus Washington woke in his own bed for the first time in weeks. The familiar surroundings should have been comforting, but he found himself startling at ordinary household sounds, a lingering effect of his time in detention. Despite his vindication and release, the psychological impact of his ordeal remained. His body was free, but his mind still carried the weight of trauma. Dr. Eleanor Washington noticed her son's flinch when she accidentally dropped a pan while making breakfast. "It's going to take time," she said, gently sitting beside him at the kitchen table. "What you experienced doesn't just disappear overnight." Marcus nodded, pushing scrambled eggs around his plate without eating. "I keep thinking about the others. All the kids who didn't have the Attorney General as their father. How many of them are still locked up because of Sullivan and his cronies?" This question hung in the air as James Washington entered the kitchen, already dressed in a suit despite being technically on personal leave. His phone buzzed constantly, with updates from Washington, D.C., where the revelation of corruption in Pinewood had triggered a much larger investigation into judicial misconduct across multiple states. "That's precisely what we're working on now," James said, having overheard his son's concern. "Based on our preliminary review, we've identified at least 342 cases in Pinewood County alone that show clear evidence of racial bias in sentencing. Each one will be reviewed for potential overturning." The scale of the corruption was still unfolding. Throughout the morning, federal agents continued to gather evidence from courthouse records, financial institutions, and the private communications of those involved. The FBI had established a temporary field office in Pinewood's municipal building, with dozens of agents and Justice Department officials working around the clock to document the extent of the conspiracy. At 11 o'clock, Attorney General Washington held a press conference on the courthouse steps, the same place where Mayor Davis had once boasted about cleaning up crime. The national media had descended on Pinewood in force, with satellite trucks lining the street and reporters from every major network jostling for position. "What we have uncovered in Pinewood County is not an isolated incident of misconduct, but a systematic subversion of justice. James Washington stated, his deep voice carrying across the assembled crowd. Preliminary evidence indicates a coordinated effort to target young people of color for disproportionate sentencing, creating a pipeline from schools to private prisons motivated by financial gain. The Attorney General outlined the initial findings: a pattern of excessive sentences for black defendants, financial connections between court officials and private prison corporations, evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and deliberate sabotage of defense representation. This investigation will continue until every case tainted by this corruption has been identified and addressed, he promised. And every individual who participated in this perversion of justice will be held accountable under federal law. The community reaction was complex and varied. For many in East Pinewood, the revelations brought vindication of suspicions long held but previously dismissed as paranoia. For others, particularly those with loved ones currently incarcerated, it brought renewed hope for justice. But some white residents expressed skepticism or outright denial, suggesting the federal intervention was politically motivated overreach. The division reflected America's broader struggle with acknowledging and addressing systemic racism. For Marcus, the days following his release were a disorienting mixture of relief, media attention, and continued processing of trauma. Despite his outward composure, he experienced nightmares about detention, startled easily at loud noises, and found himself constantly scanning rooms for potential threats, classic symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. "I should be celebrating," he confided to Miss Carter during her visit to the Washington home. "We exposed the whole corrupt system. But sometimes I still feel like I'm waiting for them to come take me away again." Miss Carter, who had risked her career and potentially her safety to help prove Marcus's innocence, understood. "What you're feeling is normal," she assured him. "Your sense of security was violated. That doesn't heal just because the truth came out." Meanwhile, the unraveling of Pinewood's corrupt justice system continued at a rapid pace. Brian Sullivan, the judge's nephew, had been arrested based on multiple witness statements and physical evidence linking him to the pharmacy robbery. Unlike his uncle's previous interventions, this time there was no one to make the charges disappear. In custody, facing serious consequences for the first time in his privileged life, Brian began cooperating with federal investigators, providing damning details about his uncle's long-standing pattern of fixing cases and manipulating the public system. "It wasn't just me," Brian admitted during his recorded statement. "Uncle Richard fixed things for lots of people who were connected. But only if they were the right color, if you know what I mean. He had a completely different standard for black kids." This explicit confirmation of racial targeting strengthened the federal case against Judge Sullivan and his co-conspirators. The investigation expanded to include executives from Oakwood private correctional facilities who had allegedly incentivized high conviction rates through a variety of means, including financial contributions to judicial campaigns, lucrative consulting contracts for retired judges, and direct payments disguised as investments in Sullivan's real estate ventures. Documents uncovered in the company's financial records revealed the disturbing economics of incarceration. Each inmate represented approximately $50,000 in annual revenue, with young offenders being particularly valuable, due to their potential for decades of imprisonment. Even as these revelations dominated local and increasingly national news, Attorney General James Washington faced political backlash in Washington, D.C. Several senators and representatives questioned whether he had used his position improperly to intervene in his son's case, ignoring that the federal investigation had been underway long before Marcus's arrest. "The timing looks suspicious," Senator William Hartwell of Alabama stated during a cable news interview. "The Attorney General needs to explain why federal resources were deployed so quickly for his son when other Americans wait years for justice." James Washington addressed these criticisms directly during a Department of Justice press briefing. The investigation into judicial misconduct in Pinewood County began 6 months ago based on statistical anomalies flagged by our Civil Rights Division, he explained. "My son's case accelerated the timeline of intervention but did not initiate it. I have recused myself from any decisions specifically related to his case, though I remain involved in the broader investigation." In Pinewood, Miss Carter channeled her experience into creating a community support program for individuals who had been wrongfully convicted or excessively sentenced. Working with local churches and civil rights organizations, she established the Justice Restoration Project, which provided legal assistance counseling and reintegration services. Most of these folks have lost years of their lives, she explained during the project's launch. They need more than just an apology and release papers. They need help rebuilding everything that was taken from them. Dr. Eleanor Washington contributed her professional expertise to this effort, leading a medical team providing free health care to those recently released from incarceration. Many showed signs of neglect or abuse during their imprisonment, with untreated conditions ranging from hypertension to diabetes to dental emergencies. The physical toll of unjust incarceration is often overlooked, she noted in her clinical reports. We're seeing patterns of accelerated aging and chronic disease that correlate directly with time spent in the prison system. For Marcus, the question of his future loomed large. Harvard had reaffirmed his acceptance and scholarship, assuring him that his ordeal would not affect his academic standing. But he found himself questioning whether immediately leaving for Cambridge was the right choice. "There's so much work to be done here," he told his parents during a family discussion. "People who need help navigating a system that was designed to fail them. Maybe I should defer enrollment for a year." James Washington understood his son's hesitation. "Whatever you decide, we'll support you. But remember that education is also a form of preparation for the fight ahead. Sometimes, stepping back to gain knowledge and perspective makes you more effective in the long run." Before Marcus could make his decision, a troubling reminder that the fight was far from over appeared on the windshield of the Washington family car, a note bearing the words, "This isn't over. Watch your back." The threat was reported to federal investigators who increased security around the Washington home. It served as a stark reminder that while the heads of the conspiracy had been removed, its roots ran deep in Pinewood's social and political structures. Those who had benefited from the corrupt system would not relinquish their power and privilege without resistance. As the first month of freedom drew to a close, Marcus found himself standing at a crossroads both literally and figuratively. Looking east toward Harvard and the future he had worked so hard to secure, and west toward Pinewood and the community that still needed healing. The path ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. 6 months after the dramatic events in the Pinewood County Courthouse, Marcus Washington stood before the Senate Judiciary Committee in Washington, D.C., his poised demeanor belying the significance of the moment. The committee room was packed with journalists, legal observers, and members of the public, all drawn to the hearings on judicial corruption that had expanded far beyond a single county in Georgia. "Mr. Washington," began Senator Elizabeth Morales, "the committee chair, please describe, for the record, your experience with the Pinewood County justice system and how it illuminates the broader issues we're examining today." Marcus adjusted the microphone, his voice steady, as he recounted the systematic discrimination and corruption he had witnessed and experienced. Over the previous months, he had evolved from victim to advocate, his natural eloquence now honed by purpose. "What happened to me was not exceptional," he testified. "The only exceptional aspect was that I had resources and connections most defendants lack. For every case like mine that comes to light, hundreds remain buried under a system designed to silence those it oppresses." The congressional hearings represented the culmination of investigations that had expanded to 12 states, revealing patterns of judicial misconduct, excessive sentencing of minorities, and financial connections to private prison corporations. Judge Richard Sullivan and his co-conspirators had become the public faces of a much larger problem, their case serving as a gateway to examining systemic injustice nationwide. Sullivan himself now faced 27 federal charges, including racketeering, civil rights violations, conspiracy evidence tampering, and corrupt influence. The evidence against him was substantial, including financial records, witness testimony, and the damning recordings from Marcus's watch that captured Sullivan's explicitly racist comments and admission of predetermined verdicts. The former judge's fall from power had been spectacular and complete. His assets were frozen, his reputation destroyed, and his freedom likely to be forfeited for decades. The man who had casually sentenced countless young black men to draconian prison terms would soon experience incarceration firsthand. District Attorney Victoria Chambers had accepted a plea deal, admitting to lesser charges in exchange for testimony against Sullivan and Mayor Davis. Her detailed account of how cases were manipulated provided investigators with a roadmap to identifying wrongful convictions. Sheriff Peterson and Mayor Davis maintained their innocence despite mounting evidence, but their political careers were finished, their names now synonymous with corruption in Pinewood. While the legal proceedings against the conspirators continued, Marcus had channeled his experience into creating lasting change. Using media attention and support from civil rights organizations, he established the Second Chance Foundation dedicated to helping wrongfully convicted youth rebuild their lives. With initial funding from several national organizations and private donors, the foundation provided legal assistance, educational opportunities, and support services to young people whose lives had been derailed by discriminatory justice systems. "We don't just want to free people from unjust incarceration," Marcus explained during the foundation's launch. "We want to give them the tools to thrive afterward. Education, housing, mental health, support everything needed to restore what was taken from them." Harvard University, impressed by Marcus's advocacy work, had not only maintained his scholarship, but created a special admission program for exonerated students. The Marcus Washington Scholars Program provided full financial support and specialized resources for students whose education had been interrupted by wrongful conviction or excessive sentencing. "Education is often the first casualty of injustice," the Harvard president noted at the program's announcement. "We're committed to restoring that opportunity." Attorney General James Washington navigated the political fallout from the Pinewood case with careful precision. While critics continued to suggest he had used his position improperly, the evidence of pre-existing investigations and his recusal from decisions specific to Marcus's case blunted these accusations. More importantly, the scope of corruption uncovered had shifted public attention from procedural questions to substantive concerns about judicial integrity nationwide. James used the momentum to push for systematic reforms, including mandatory tracking of sentencing disparities, independent oversight of judicial conduct, elimination of privately operated prisons, and restoration of voting rights for prisons and restoration of voting rights. Formerly incarcerated individuals. What happened in Pinewood County wasn't an anomaly, he testified before Congress. It was simply the most visible manifestation of problems that exist throughout our justice system. In Pinewood itself, the changes were both immediate and profound. A federal judge had been appointed to review all cases handled by Sullivan during his tenure, with priority given to those showing potential racial bias. Within 6 months, 97 individuals had been released after their convictions were overturned or sentences reduced. Each release represented a life reclaimed from injustice, a family reunited, and a small step toward healing community wounds. One unexpected development occurred when Margaret Sullivan, the judge's wife, suffered a severe cardiac event requiring emergency surgery. Despite her husband's role in attempting to destroy Marcus's life and damage Dr. Washington's career, Eleanor Washington was the only cardiac surgeon available with the specific expertise needed. Without hesitation, she performed the life-saving operation. "Medicine isn't about who deserves care," she explained when questioned about her decision. "It's about providing healing to everyone, regardless of circumstance." This act of compassion resonated throughout Pinewood, challenging assumptions and opening conversations that might otherwise have remained closed. As the 1-year anniversary of Marcus's arrest approached, the community organized a celebration of those who had been exonerated and released. The event, held at the same community center where Marcus had been tutoring during the pharmacy robbery, brought together families torn apart by unjust incarceration and now reunited. The atmosphere was bittersweet joy at freedom restored, mingled with acknowledgement of time irretrievably lost. Brian Sullivan's sentencing hearing provided a stark contrast to the treatment Marcus and others had received in the same courthouse. With federal oversight ensuring procedural fairness, Brian received 15 years for armed robbery and drug trafficking, with eligibility for early release based on rehabilitation progress. The sentence was proportionate to his crimes without being vindictively excessive, precisely the type of justice denied to countless black defendants under his uncle's regime. 2 years after the Pinewood case broke open, Marcus Washington stood at the podium of the National Criminal Justice Reform Conference in Chicago. Now a junior at Harvard majoring in constitutional law and African American studies, he had become a leading voice in the movement to address systemic racism in America's legal system. The corruption in Pinewood wasn't an aberration, he told the assembled lawyers, activists, and policymakers. It was simply a more visible version of what happens every day across this country. The challenge we face isn't just removing bad actors from the system, it's recognizing that the system itself was designed to produce exactly the results we've seen. His speech detailed the concrete reforms implemented in Pinewood County and beyond independent review boards for sentencing patterns, elimination of financial incentives for incarceration, mandatory disclosure of judicial financial interests, and community oversight of prosecutor conduct. Each represented a small step toward accountability in a system that had operated without meaningful scrutiny for generations. The final slide in his presentation showed a projection into the future. Marcus Washington, J.D., arguing before the Supreme Court in a landmark case on equal protection under the law. It wasn't merely aspirational. It was his declared intention, a path from victim to advocate, to architect of systemic change. After the conference, Marcus and his father walked along Chicago's lakefront, the skyline, illuminated against the evening sky. "Do you ever wish none of this had happened?" James asked. "That you could have just gone straight to Harvard without becoming the face of judicial reform at 17, Marcus considered the question carefully before answering. "Sometimes I think about that alternative timeline, who I might have been without Pinewood Detention Center and Judge Sullivan. But then I think about Anthony Carter, who was released after serving 8 years for a crime he didn't commit, and Darnell Jackson, who got 20 years for a nonviolent offense that white kids got probation for. They didn't have an attorney general for a father." He paused, watching the waves lap against the shore. "If my suffering helped expose the system that destroyed their lives, then no, I wouldn't change it. Sometimes you have to walk through the darkness to show others the way out." Later that week, Marcus met with a young man recently released after his conviction was overturned through the Second Chance Foundation's legal aid program. Terrell Simmons had spent 3 years incarcerated for a robbery that physical evidence eventually proved he couldn't have committed. Now, 21, he was struggling to rebuild a life interrupted. "How do you even start over?" Terrell asked, his voice heavy with the weight of lost time. "Everything and everyone moved on without me." Marcus recognized the pain and disorientation in Terrell's eyes, the same feelings he had grappled with, albeit after a much shorter incarceration. "The system can work," Marcus told him, "but sometimes you need to make it work. Let me help you." As they began discussing educational opportunities and support services, Marcus reflected on how far he had come from that moment in Judge Sullivan's courtroom when life imprisonment seemed inevitable. The path from victim to survivor to advocate hadn't been easy, but it had transformed personal tragedy into meaningful change. Justice delayed was still justice denied, but justice revealed created the possibility for a system finally accountable to all it claimed to serve. What would you do if you found yourself facing injustice in a system designed to silence you? Would you have the courage to stand up like Marcus did? Let us know in the comments below. If this story of courage in the face of corruption moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of justice and resilience. Share this video with someone who needs to understand how systemic racism operates in our justice system and how brave individuals can make a difference. Thank you for joining us on this journey through darkness into light. Remember that change begins with awareness, and your voice matters in the ongoing fight for true equality under the law. Marcus Washington's journey teaches us that justice, though promised to all, isn't delivered equally in America. The story exposes how racial discrimination can be systematically embedded within our legal institutions, creating two distinct experiences of justice based on skin color. It reveals the dangerous intersection of prejudice and profit, where the incarceration of black youth becomes a business model rather than rehabilitation. The courage to speak truth to power stands as the central lesson. Even when facing overwhelming odds and corrupt systems, one voice backed by evidence and determination can trigger meaningful change. Marcus shows us that preparation and education are powerful weapons against injustice. Family and community emerge as crucial support systems. Without Dr. Washington's unwavering advocacy, Miss Chapter 7 wondered out. Carter's investigation and Attorney General Washington's position, Marcus might have become another statistic. Perhaps most importantly, the story demonstrates that exposure alone isn't enough. True justice requires systematic reform, changing laws, policies, and institutional structures that enable discrimination. Individual bad actors can be removed, but without addressing the underlying systems, injustice continues. Finally, Marcus teaches us about transforming personal trauma into purposeful action. By establishing the Second Chance Foundation and becoming an advocate, he turned his suffering into salvation for others, showing that our most painful experiences can become platforms for creating the change we wish to see. What systems of injustice exist in your community that need to be challenged? Have you ever witnessed discrimination that went unchallenged because it was just how things work? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If Marcus's fight against a corrupt system moved you, please hit that like button to help this story reach others who need to hear it. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives about individuals standing up against systemic racism and injustice in America. This story isn't just about one teenager's victory. It's about recognizing how prejudice operates within our institutions and the courage required to dismantle it. Share this video with someone who might not understand how racial bias continues to shape justice outcomes in our country. Thank you for bearing witness to Marcus's journey from victim to advocate. May his story inspire you to speak up when you encounter injustice, knowing that sometimes one voice is all it takes to begin unraveling a corrupt system. Together we can build a future where justice truly means justice for all.